ES Audio.
From the Evening Standard in London, I'm Rochelle Travers, and this is The Leader. It's officially back to school, but not for everyone.
It's a scandal that as children are just returning to school, ministers are still not being upfront about the scale of what we're facing. It's vital that they publish the list of all of the schools as soon as possible. If they don't do that, we'll force a vote in the House of Commons to make sure that parents can know exactly what's going on.
Shadow Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson there. It's the start of a new academic year, but dozens of schools in England are fully or partially closed due to potentially unsafe, reinforced, autoclaved aerated concrete, also known as RAAC. The lightweight material was used in schools between the 1950s to 1990s because it's cheaper, quicker to produce and easier to install than standard concrete. However, it's less durable and only has a lifespan of around 30 years.
Out of the 15,000 that were built in the period, 90% responded to the surveys. Only 1% of them had any RAAC. Between those, we basically categorised them, or the engineers did, between critical and non-critical. The critical 52 were already done, and the 104 were deemed as non-critical, which the advice and guidance from the Institute of Structural Engineers was to monitor those and they didn't need any particular action. Over the summer, when I sent engineers in to see two incidents that we could get access to, we identified that there was a case where a roof that had been assessed as non-critical had a panel that had fallen. So that is what has created the change.
Education Secretary Gillian Keegan there, speaking on BBC Breakfast, where she also confirmed that at least 104 schools still have RAAC, but the total number could be in the hundreds. Now, there is growing pressure on the government to publish a full list of all the schools affected as soon as possible. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has also hit back at those blaming him for the crisis, after claims he was warned of a critical risk to life from crumbling schools in 2021, when he was Chancellor. Joining me now is Jitendra Joshi, the Evening Standard's Deputy Political Editor.
This is a problem that's been known for a few years now, and the government says it has been surveying schools, local authorities initially, and then schools directly for a few months, and that it was aware that there was a potential problem in a few hundred schools potentially. But this really accelerated last month when a school where a previous survey had found what they said was a non-critical issue that just needed monitoring, that then got upgraded to a critical issue in one aerated concrete supporting one ceiling. And in light of that, they decided that they had to vastly accelerate this program of checks. And that's why we got the announcement only a few days ago, right heading into the start of the new school year, that 156 schools were now identified as containing the most problematic form of this concrete, and that 104 were going to need urgent repairs that required either the whole school to be closed or some of the buildings inside of those schools. So it's spelt massive disruption for children and their parents at the schools affected. This morning, the Education Secretary, Gillian Keegan, was saying that potentially hundreds more schools might need urgent repair work. The reason is she says they're still waiting on survey responses from some 1,500 schools out of 24 to 25,000 or so schools in England. And she's hopeful, she says, that the publicity surrounding this is now going to mean that the heads and local authorities involved in those schools or trusts managing those academies are going to get back to the department as soon as possible so that they can get a grip on the problem as a whole. Opposition parties are saying that the government has known of this problem for years and has left it far too late and should have dealt with this much sooner.
The Prime Minister's come out today and said it's utterly wrong to blame him for this. Why is the finger being pointed at him exactly?
That's right. So the opposition parties are attacking Rishi Sunak for decisions he made when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer beginning in February 2020, when he cut the budget for school repairs. And those attacks have really been turbocharged this morning by an interview that the former permanent secretary at the Department for Education, Jonathan Slater, gave, where he said when he was at the department, the officials had pleaded with Mr. Sunak's Treasury Department that some 300 to 400 schools a year in England needed urgent repairs. Funding, he says, was only given for 100, and that funding figure that was then halved to mean that only 50 schools a year could receive the urgent repairs they needed. So opposition parties are saying that that means that Mr. Sunak was effectively playing with children's lives, and the official in question, Jonathan Slater, says that he and his department warned the Treasury when Sunak was in charge that there was quite a critical risk to life from school buildings crumbling. The Prime Minister this morning has pushed back strongly on that and said the government was taking this issue seriously and that these attacks are unwarranted.
If the PM isn't at fault, do we have any idea who is to blame at this point?
Well, there's a lot of finger pointing going on, of course. Part of the issue is that the government is accused of, for ideological reasons, paring back the budget on school repairs because it wanted more money for innovative new schools such as free schools. The government denies that, but for sure there's a lot of blame being apportioned now and a lot of counter arguments being made. The Conservatives, Ms Keegan this morning, saying that Labour themselves knew about this problem when they were in power up until 2010 and did nothing to fix it. Labour, for their part, counter that actually they had a very ambitious programme of school repairs and building going on, which when they took power with the Liberal Democrats in 2010, the Conservatives put a halt to. How this plays out is going to be a question of who gets more, which argument gets more credence, but certainly for parents up and down the country anxious to know about the safety of their children, they're going to want to know that these repairs are being dealt with as soon as possible. And beyond that, certainly you would think there's going to be a political price to pay if this narrative sticks, that the Tory governments, successive Tory governments in the last 13 years turned a blind eye to this.
Let's go to the ads. Stay there to hear more from the Evening Standard's Deputy Political Editor, Jitendra Joshi, on how it's not just schools that are being impacted and the bubbling row over who will be made to pay for these repairs. Why not hit rate and follow in the meantime? Welcome back. Still with me is the Evening Standard's Deputy Political Editor, Jitendra Joshi. Now, obviously, we've been discussing schools mainly there, but it's not just schools that could be impacted by this concrete, is it?
That's correct. So we know of concerns surrounding hospitals and court buildings, among other parts of the public sector estate. A number of hospitals were already being rebuilt, and the government says it's committed to 20 new hospitals. And that in itself is mired in controversy because the question is, when are those buildings going to be ready, and are they in fact entirely new or just old money that is being recycled and old buildings that are being patched up? At least one court building in London, in Harrow, was affected and has had to close because of this issue with the RAAC concrete specifically. So the problem certainly does go wider than schools.
How long could it be until these problems are rectified?
Well, that's the other issue for concerned parents. How long is this going to take? We're not getting any particular clarity on that. Ms. Keegan again this morning was saying they're going to work as quickly as possible. They've got structural engineers on the case. They've got remedial work going on in the meantime, propping up classrooms. Her argument is that they've acted as quickly as they could once they understood the scale of this crisis, and they're not going to waste any time on getting to grips with it. So in parallel to all this, the major concern for parents is not knowing exactly which schools are affected, or for the public at large to not know. The government says it intends to publish a list this week. It wants parents to find out first from their schools once those schools have been notified by the Department for Education, rather than finding out secondhand from the media. and that it wants to reassure concerned parents of whatever work is being done at those schools, so they're not operating in an information black hole. But again, this all is taking a bit of time. Meanwhile, public fears have been growing as to the safety of these buildings.
And do we know who's going to have to pay for these repairs?
Now, that seems to have turned into a slight tug of war between the Treasury Department and Ms Keegan's department. So yesterday, the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, said the government would do whatever it takes, in his words, and that schools would not have to shoulder the costs themselves. Then it emerged that the Treasury was clarifying that actually what that meant was the funding would come from government coffers, i.e. from the Department for Education itself, rather than from any new money coming from the Treasury. The concern there is then, well, what does that mean? The Department for Education is going to have to cut back elsewhere to shoulder a bill for sudden repairs that it wasn't anticipating. Gillian Keegan this morning stressed that would not be the case, that they do have funds earmarked, ongoing funds for schools rebuilding, and that parents should not worry that there would be cutbacks elsewhere. But that assurance only for now applies to structural repairs and other physical remedial measures such as girders in classrooms. What it doesn't cover yet is the additional costs that some schools are having to find money for, such as buses to take kids to alternative sites. Ms Keegan said those costs would be covered on a case-by-case basis as schools need. But again, starting a new school term, a new school year with all this added complication is the last thing that head teachers are going to need.
You can read more on this story and others in the Evening Standard newspaper or on our website, standard.co.uk. And that's it from this episode of The Leader. This podcast is back tomorrow at 4 p.m.